Welcome back to the channel. My name's James. I'm a trainee accountant and I believe that the best investment you can make is in yourself. In this video I want to look at the minimum wage, which has recently increased here in the UK. If you're 23 and over, it's increased by £1.02, meaning that the minimum wage per hour is £11.44. Many employees might be excited by this. You're probably an average employee if you are. Unfortunately, employees who choose to invest in themselves, they build their skill sets, they're building their knowledge, they're gaining qualifications. For you, it probably isn't that great. And of course, if you're an employer, it really isn't looking great for you, either with all the extra costs that you now have to pay out. So how can you navigate the minimum wage? And what are my thoughts on the minimum wage increase and the impact and effect it can have on average employees, employees who choose to invest in themselves, and also employers? Let's have a little look at that in this video. Now, if you're an employee who's excited about the minimum wage increase, hold fire. There are a few things that you need to bear in mind before you get really excited. One thing you need to remember is that it's not your gross pay or your hourly pay. The most important thing is actually your take-home pay or your net pay. After all the taxes have been deducted, how much are you taking home? And with that in mind, there are a few things we need to consider. The first thing is thresholds. So what happens is you can fall under certain thresholds, and at certain points you'll pay more tax than at others. So let's say your first £12,570 is completely tax free. You pay no income tax, at least, or PAYE as they call it, on that first £12,570. Great. However, that threshold has been frozen along with all the others, and therefore if you earn above that, well, you're going to be paying tax for the first time. And here's the thing, if your hourly rate has gone up and you're working the same hours, the chances are you've now gone over that threshold. You will now be paying tax. There are higher tax thresholds as well, and if you go over them, you'll go into a higher tax category where you can pay even more tax than what you will pay once you go over that first threshold. So that's the first thing to bear in mind. They've all been frozen, the minimum wage has gone up. Therefore, more people will now be pushed over the threshold and will be paying tax. Another factor to keep in mind is inflation. Inflation is what pushes the cost of goods and services up every single year. Normally, they try and keep it at 2%. Recent years, that's gone completely out the window and it's been all over the place and extremely high. But normally, they try and keep it at 2%. So the costs of goods and services, they all increase. A good example of this is if you go to the shop and you buy the same product for a number of years, you will eventually notice that the size of that product slightly shrinks in size, and yet the cost goes up. And that's businesses trying to not put their costs up too high so you will not buy the product, but at the same time trying to reduce the cost. So they shrink the size, save a bit of money on producing the product or service, and then they put the price up so therefore they can cover their costs as well. Now, inflation might push the cost of the products and services up. However, there'll be additional costs as well, such as the minimum wage increasing, because don't forget, businesses have to pay not only your wages, they have to pay a tax on recruiting you. Yes, they pay an employer's national insurance. It's another form of income tax. Your employer pays a tax. They are punished for recruiting you. They have to pay that, which will now be even higher because it's based on a percentage. And then they have to pay your additional wages, and then you may now be qualifying for a pension contribution, depends on if you're eligible or not, and therefore their costs are now going to go even higher. And therefore businesses are left in a position where they have to push costs up a little bit more to cover all of their additional expenses, or because the minimum wage has increased. Not only that, businesses may be forced to cut back on recruitment. They may have to reduce your hours that you work. They may even have to cut back on overtime, which for many people brings in extra much needed cash that might not be available because businesses can no longer afford it. So your gross pay may have increased. Your net pay may be slightly higher, depending. However, what is the spending power of that? Well, thanks to inflation and thanks to the minimum wage, which has meant that businesses have to push costs up further, it now potentially means that you may not have the same spending power. £10 yesterday might not get you the same amount of goods that it would today. What your money can buy is no longer the same. The power of that spending has decreased. You may have been able to buy a whole load of shopping at £50. However, now that same shopping will cost you £60, for example. And therefore your take-home pay may look more, but its spending power has been reduced. So have you really had a pay rise? Well, on paper, yeah, but in reality, potentially not. Real terms is another important factor. Take-home pay and what is the spending power of your take-home pay? What is it in real terms? And they're two things you need to bear in mind before you get excited about a minimum wage. Now, of course, there are other taxes that you need to take into consideration that are not taken directly from your wages. PAYE and national insurance are two types of income taxes that are taken directly from your wages. There are also indirect taxes that you pay after you've got your net pay, your take-home pay. Those taxes include things like road tax, which always increases. It includes things like council tax. Again, many council taxes have increased by 10%, if not even more. So yes, you have your take-home pay and you've had the direct taxes deducted, but don't forget you've also got indirect taxes that you have to pay, and they've all shot up as well. So even if your net take-home pay is higher than what it used to be, you've still got all these additional taxes that you need to pay, which actually can just eat into your net pay. Of course, you may think that you're getting a pay rise because you're great at your job. Well, actually, you're not. You're getting a pay rise because the government simply threatened your employer to give you a pay rise, and if your employer doesn't comply, well, they get fined, they can get imprisoned, the business will get potentially closed down, and therefore they have to pay that wage. It sounds a little bit like the mafia. Pay or else. Short of having a gun to your employer's head. So are you getting a pay rise because you earned it, because you're good at your job, because you invest in yourself, you build skill sets and gain qualifications and build knowledge? Or is it because actually it's the bare minimum you can get away with paying you without facing the wrath of the mafia? I mean the government. Now, what if you're an employee who is a smart worker, you invest in yourself, you're building qualifications, skill sets and knowledge? All of a sudden now, other employees who are average are going to start catching up to your hourly rate or to what your pay is. The gap between them and you is closing, and yet the average person who doesn't do those things is catching up to you. You may even have a case where you've got the average employee who's catching up to a supervisor's pay, or even a senior's pay, depending on where you work. And in fact, I've experienced this. It wasn't me, thankfully, but when I was working for a retailer, one of the things that happened was they couldn't get anyone to be promoted to a senior or to a supervisor because the pay difference was so small and insignificant. It wasn't worth the extra responsibility to take the promotion. Therefore, they struggled to get people who wanted to be promoted because the pay was narrowed and closed down between the two of them. So you are too at a loss. If you're someone who's a supervisor, all of a sudden the average employee is catching up to you with little to no responsibility. And of course, you're an employee who does invest in yourself, or the person who can't be bothered and wants to go home and binge watch TV. Guess what? Their pay is catching up to you. Now, one of the things you could do is you could go to your employer and ask for a pay rise. Now, you may laugh at that, but at the end of the day, you don't ask, you don't get. And if you're going to go to your employer and ask for that pay rise, you have to provide justification for that. You can't just walk into the boss's office and say, hey, I want a pay rise. And yes, a good point and a good argument is the fact that everyone else's wages have gone up. What is my value in this new market? If that's now the new minimum wage, what is my value in terms of hourly pay? That's a valid point. But also you need to go in there and you need to make the case that actually you do invest in yourself. You point to your knowledge, your skill set, your qualifications, how you're still developing and investing in yourself. And you have to make the case that you're a good worker, you're a smart worker, and try and reason with your employer and justify why you should have that pay rise. So that's something to bear in mind. It's definitely something to try. Your employer might say no, and there might be a genuine reason for that. It may be a simple case that they genuinely cannot afford it, and therefore they're in a rock and a hard place because they've been forced to pay everybody else more, and therefore that money that might have gone to you as a bonus or as a pay increase is now going to them, and therefore you're at a loss. And you should be frustrated at this point. I will be really frustrated at this point. Now, you may be tempted to look at the situation and think, well, why bother? Why bother investing in myself? All these average people are catching up to me. My wages aren't going up at the same or a similar rate to theirs. Why do I simply bother? And honestly, investing in yourself is the best thing that you can do. I think it's Alec Hormozzi actually says the best investment you can make is not in the S&P 500, but it's the S&Me 500. I fully agree with that statement. I think the best investment you can make is in yourself. And if you are feeling frustrated and in that position, honestly, just keep persevering and keep building your knowledge, your skill set, and your qualifications, because it will give you options in the long run. Another option is to change jobs. In fact, they reckon that you should change jobs every 2 to 3 years in order to simply maintain a competitive salary. In fact, in doing so, you can get a much better increase in your rate of pay by doing so. Forbes estimated that your yearly increase in pay is around about 3%. However, by switching jobs, some articles are suggesting that pay rate could increase by around about 10 to 20%. There are many articles online. You can just Google it and it'll pull up a long list of them that will talk about this and explain it in more detail. It's not just the rate of pay that will go up as you move from one job to another. There'll also be other perks and benefits to that job. There may be remote working and flexible working. So it's not just your rate of pay. And the reason for this is actually quite simple. It's that employers are trying to attract the best talent out there. In order to do that, you have to offer a competitive salary, and therefore they need to pay more. If you're already in the company, well, they just pay you the 3%, as Forbes suggested. Another route that you may want to consider going down, which is a bit more radical and out there, is cease to be an employee and become an employer. Become your own boss. Become self-employed, become a freelancer, become an entrepreneur, start your own business. That way you're in full control, you're in control of your wages, and not only that, you're in control of your lifestyle as well. It opens up more doors. So for example, if you wanted to, you could work and travel at the same time and become a digital nomad. Now that option is available to those who choose to invest in themselves, who are building those skill sets, building the knowledge, getting those qualifications. That's an option for you, and that's why it is important that despite the situation when you get frustrated at people's rates of pay catching up with yours, continue to invest in yourself, because that option will be available to you. It won't be available to the people who are sat at home binge watching on TV. And of course, there are pros and cons to this, and you need to take those pros and cons on board, do your own research, do your own homework, and draw your own conclusions. I'm just simply sharing my thoughts and some of the things that I'm considering right now. Starting your own business, becoming an entrepreneur, you may sit there and think to yourself, well, I've still got the problem of paying a minimum wage to these employees I hired to help run my business. Well, there's another option there as well. It's called the solopreneur route. Like an entrepreneur, except you don't need to hire employees. Well, let's say you do need additional skill sets to run the business for whatever reasons. There's nothing stopping you using freelancers or simply starting a partnership with somebody else and therefore building the business together where you utilize each other's skill set without having the need for that minimum wage. There are 2 books that are on my reading list that talk about the solopreneur idea. The first one is The Minimalist Entrepreneur, which I've listened to a few book summaries of, and it sounds really good, and I do want to read it at some point this year. The second book is called Company for One. Again, I've listened to a few book reviews on this. It sounds really good, and it's another book that I do want to read at some point this year as well. So both of those books, I've listened to the summaries. I recommend them on that basis alone. It was enough to make me want to read the book, so I'm just putting it out there. Now, what would I do if I was an employer? What would be going through my mind? Well, one of the first things would be to leverage technology. A great example of this is McDonald's. A couple of years back, the state of California insisted that McDonald's should increase its minimum wage, and eventually it put it into law that McDonald's should increase their minimum wage. I think it was around about $15 an hour. McDonald's response to this was quite simple. We'll just put in those self-service desks. And therefore people can order on the screen. We need less staff to take those orders, and therefore we only need staff to give you your order and to actually make the food in the back. In fact, McDonald's has gone a step further, and there are 1 or 2 that are fully automated today. So it gives you an idea of leveraging technology, how powerful it can be, how useful it can be. And honestly, if I was an employer right now, that would be something going through my mind. How can I leverage technology to my advantage? What if you actually need to have employees? Well, you have options. You can use contractors, you can use freelancers, you can bring them in as and when you need them to do specific jobs, and just pay them a flat fee, and therefore you remove the need for the payroll, you remove the need for the extra expenses to fund the accountancy team or the accountancy department. And another option which I found from the 4-Hour Workweek by Tim Ferriss was actually just hiring remote workers abroad. Now, in doing this, you avoid all the hassle of recruiting here in the UK, you avoid all these unnecessary recruitment laws, you avoid all these minimum wage rates, etc., all the pension contributions, etc., etc. And of course, some may argue that, well, this isn't fair, you're taking advantage of cheaper labour abroad. Well, actually, in some countries, that rate of pay is actually really good pay, and you're helping people to provide for their own families, to help themselves out of poverty, and you're giving them a job and giving them meaning and purpose. So when people sit back and say, well, that's just not fair, you're just using slave labour, actually that's not always the case. Sometimes that rate of pay over there might be a great rate of pay, but over here it's simply not. And when we're living in a world where we're becoming more of a global economy, I just don't see that argument as a valid argument anymore at all. So personally, I have no problem with it. I don't think it's immoral. In fact, I think it's very moral, because that way I can truly help people by doing that, or by you doing that. I can help other people abroad in other countries better themselves, get themselves out of poverty, and provide for their families without relying on handouts. If I had my own business and it was a middle-sized business, honestly, I'd be in two mindsets at this point. One mindset would be, well, do I shrink the size of my business, go under all those thresholds, such as the VAT threshold, which comes with a whole host of paperwork and hassle, or do I scale the business and try and make it a multi-million pound business or a multi-million dollar business? I don't think sitting in the middle is a wise choice, if I'm honest. I feel like if you're a big company, you can take the hit of a minimum wage increase and the expenses that come with it. And if you're a smaller company, or you're a solopreneur, for example, well, then all of a sudden you're under all those thresholds and you're in a better position to deal with than the middle-sized company. Although, no, you don't have the deep pockets, you do have that flexibility to move and pivot, and therefore I think you're in a better position. So if I was sat in the middle with a middle-sized business, I would be thinking, do I scale it all up and go all the way, or do I shrink it back in size and stay below those thresholds? So I hope you found this video interesting and insightful. These are just some of my thoughts, my opinions on the current situations, and they're not financial advice. Obviously, you should do your own homework, do your own research, speak to advisors who can go into more depth and detail. But this is just my thoughts on the situation. I hope you found it helpful, insightful, and interesting. If you did like it, hit the subscribe button, and hopefully see you in the next video. Take care.